Jason had just returned home from work, the hum of his car engine fading as he stepped into the quiet house. The faint aroma of dinner lingered in the air, though it was clear Sarah had already eaten. His usual routine was about to be disrupted in the most unimaginable way. As he settled into his favorite armchair, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Frowning, Jason hesitated before answering. "Mr. Jason Carter?" a polite yet firm voice asks. "This is Linda from First National Bank. I'm calling to confirm the terms of your recent loan application." Jason sat up straight. "Loan application? I haven't applied for any loan." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, this loan, totaling $75,000, was approved last month. The funds were disbursed to your account and transferred shortly thereafter. The signature on the application matches your record." Jason's heart began to pound. "There's some mistake. I never authorized this. Could you come to the branch tomorrow? We'll need to verify your identity and investigate this further." After hanging up, Jason sat motionless, his mind racing. Who would do this? How did this happen? His thoughts were interrupted by Sarah entering the room, her phone in hand, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look pale," she said, tilting her head. "Bad day?" Jason considered telling her but decided against it. "Just some confusion at work. I'll handle it." That night, as Sarah slept soundly beside him, Jason lay awake, scrolling through his online banking app. The transaction history revealed the truth. $75,000 transferred to an unfamiliar account labeled. His blood ran cold. The next morning, Jason arrived at the bank promptly at 9 a.m. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his calm exterior masked a growing storm inside. Linda, the bank representative he had spoken to, greeted him in the lobby and led him to a private office. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming in," she began. "We take fraud very seriously, and I'll personally assist you." Linda produced the loan documents. Jason's eyes immediately zeroed in on the signature line. There it was, unmistakably similar to his handwriting, but with a subtle sloppiness, the kind only someone imitating him would overlook. "This isn't my signature," Jason declared firmly, his voice controlled but icy. "Whoever submitted this was forging it." Linda adjusted her glasses, scanning the signature closely. "And you have no knowledge of where the funds went?" Jason shook his head. "None." She tapped on her keyboard, opening the digital ledger. "The funds were wired to an account in the name of Eric Thompson. Does that name mean anything to you?" Jason clenched his jaw. Eric. The man Sarah had mentioned in passing months ago as a casual acquaintance, someone Jason had never paid attention to. The pieces started falling into place. A gnawing suspicion formed in the pit of his stomach. "Can you provide any more information about this account?" Jason pressed. "I'm afraid we'll need a formal fraud report for that," Linda said gently, but with a sympathetic tone. "You'll need to involve law enforcement." Jason left the bank with the copies of the forged documents in hand, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel as he drove home. By the time he reached his driveway, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't just barge into this conversation without clear evidence. He needed to know more, to confront Sarah from a position of undeniable truth. That evening, Jason prepared dinner as Sarah walked through the door, dressed impeccably as usual, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders like a perfect frame around her polished face. "You cooked," she said with a smile, her eyes flickering with surprise. Jason managed a tight smile. "Yeah, thought we could have a quiet night in." The tension in his voice was slight but enough for Sarah to notice. She hesitated but brushed it off. As they sat down to eat, Jason began laying the groundwork for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. "How was your day?" he asked casually, slicing into his steak. "Busy," Sarah responded with practiced ease. "You know how it is with clients these days, demanding as ever." Jason tilted his head. "And Eric, how's he doing?" For a fraction of a second, Sarah's fork stopped midair. The hesitation was brief, but Jason caught it. "Eric?" she repeated, forcing a laugh. "What makes you ask about him?" "No reason," Jason said, shrugging. "Just wondering." The rest of the meal passed in relative silence, but Jason's mind was anything but silent. Every glance, every subtle reaction from Sarah only fueled his certainty. Something wasn't right. Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Jason sat in his home office, poring over bank statements and receipts. He began compiling every financial detail he could find. He noted the timeline of the forged loan, the transfer of funds, and the sudden, unexplained purchases Sarah had made in recent months. Designer clothes, extravagant dinners, and a luxury spa membership, all things Jason had chalked up to her personal indulgences. Like now they painted a far darker picture. Determined to leave no stone unturned, Jason reached out to a friend from college who worked as a private investigator. "Mike," Jason said over the phone, his voice low but urgent. "I need your help." "Anything for you, buddy," Mike replied. "What's going on?" Jason gave him a brief summary of the situation, careful not to let his voice crack under the weight of betrayal. "I need you to look into Sarah and this Eric Thompson guy. Consider it done," Mike said. As Jason hung up the phone, he felt a strange calm settle over him. This wasn't just about financial fraud. This was about trust, about his marriage, and the deep chasm of betrayal Sarah had dug beneath him. The calm wasn't peace, it was resolve. 2 days later, Mike called with a grim tone. "Jason, you were right to be suspicious." Jason sat up straighter. "What did you find?" "Eric's a con artist," Mike explained. "He has a history of targeting married women, especially those in affluent households. Sarah's not his first." Jason's breath caught. "And Sarah? What's her involvement?" "And seeing him regularly," Mike confirmed, "at a hotel downtown, room 214, every Thursday." Jason closed his eyes, a mix of fury and disbelief washing over him. He had the confirmation he needed, but it didn't make the betrayal any less painful. That night, Jason stood in the living room as Sarah walked in, unsuspecting as ever. He held up the bank documents, his expression unreadable. "Care to explain these?" he asked quietly. Sarah's face went pale, her composure crumbling for the first time. "Jason, I can explain." "No," Jason interrupted, his voice cold and cutting. "You're going to tell me the truth, right now." Caught like a deer in headlights, Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Jason's eyes narrowed. "Talking," he said, "because I already know everything." Jason's words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Sarah's carefully curated mask of composure began to crack, her auburn hair falling over her face as she sat down, trying to gather her thoughts. Jason didn't move. He stood firm, arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on her like a prosecutor in the courtroom he knew was in their future. What do you mean you know everything?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling. Jason stepped forward, dropping the forged loan documents and a stack of receipts on the coffee table. "I've been to the bank, Sarah. I know about the loan in my name, I know about the money, and I know where it went." He leaned closer, his voice low and dangerous. "To Eric." Sarah's eyes widened for a split second before she forced a laugh, a hollow sound that did nothing to mask her panic. "Jason, you're being ridiculous. Eric's just a friend." "Don't," Jason interrupted, his voice rising as anger broke through his controlled demeanor. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence by lying to my face. I know you've been seeing him, using my name, my credit, my life to fund your..." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but Jason wasn't moved. He'd seen enough crocodile tears to recognize them now. "Okay," she said softly, lowering her gaze. "I made a mistake." Jason laughed bitterly. "A mistake? Forging my signature and stealing $75,000 isn't a mistake, Sarah. It's a crime." The weight of Jason's words seemed to crush Sarah, and for a moment she looked genuinely defeated. "Jason," she began, her voice quivering. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. Eric, he promised me things. He said he needed help, and I thought I was just lending him money. I didn't know it would hurt you like this." Jason's jaw tightened and his voice dripped with contempt. "You didn't think it would hurt me? Did you think about me at all? Or were you too busy living in your fantasy with Eric?" Sarah broke down, sobbing into her hands. But Jason remained unmoved. He had spent countless sleepless nights doubting himself, questioning what he might have done wrong. Now the truth was out, and his anger eclipsed any trace of sympathy he might have once felt. "Tell me everything," he demanded. "Every lie, every secret." Piece by piece, Sarah began to confess. She admitted to meeting Eric through a mutual acquaintance at a charity event last year. What started as innocent conversations quickly evolved into late-night texts, secret dinners, and eventually a full-blown affair. Eric, charming and manipulative, had convinced her to fund his business ventures, painting himself as a misunderstood entrepreneur on the verge of a breakthrough. "And you believed him?" Jason asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You believed this con artist so much that you risked everything we built together?" Sarah's sobs grew louder. "I was unhappy, Jason. I felt invisible in our marriage. You were always working, always so focused on your goals. Eric made me feel seen." Jason's laughter was cold and humorless. "Seen? Do you feel seen now, Sarah? Because I'm seeing you for exactly what you are, a liar and a thief." Jason didn't let the conversation linger on her excuses. He had work to do. Over the next few days, he intensified his efforts to secure himself legally and financially. He locked Sarah out of their joint accounts, canceled all shared credit cards, and moved his most valuable belongings into a secure storage unit. His lawyer, an old friend named Daniel, walked him through every step. "This isn't just about divorce," Daniel explained as they sat in his office. "You need to protect yourself from liability. If she took out that loan in your name, the bank might still come after you. We'll file a fraud report and use it as part of your case." Jason nodded, his resolve hardening with each piece of advice. "I want her to face consequences, Daniel, not just in court, but in life. She needs to understand what she's done." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Are you prepared for that? These things can get messy." Jason met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes." While Jason methodically dismantled the foundation of their shared life, Sarah clung to whatever scraps of control she could. She attempted to reach out to Jason's friends and family, spinning stories of a misunderstanding, painting herself as a victim of Eric's manipulation. But Jason had already warned them, sharing the evidence he'd uncovered. One by one, her allies evaporated. Eric, meanwhile, had vanished. Jason's investigator discovered he'd fled the city as soon as he realized Jason was building a case. His disappearance only added fuel to Jason's determination. The day Jason filed for divorce, he returned home to find Sarah waiting for him. Her once polished appearance was now haggard, her eyes swollen from crying. "Jason," she said, stepping toward him, "please don't do this. I know I messed up, but we can fix it. We've been through so much together." Jason stared at her, his expression unreadable. "No, Sarah. I've been through so much. Because of you. This isn't something we can fix. You made your choice." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but Jason turned away. He'd spent too long in the shadow of her betrayal, and now he was ready to step into the light. The divorce proceedings were swift but grueling. Jason presented every piece of evidence, the forged documents, the bank records, and even Sarah's own confessions. By the time it was over, Sarah was left with nothing but the consequences of her actions. Jason, meanwhile, walked away with his dignity and a newfound clarity about what he deserved in life. The story of Jason and Sarah was far from over, but for Jason, this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter built on resilience, strength, and the unshakable belief that justice, no matter how delayed, always prevails. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the warm, lived-in spaces Jason had once shared with Sarah. The sterile air, the echo of footsteps, and the murmur of voices gave the place an imposing weight. Jason stood on the plaintiff's side, his lawyer Daniel by his side, while Sarah sat across from him, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. Gone was the confident, polished woman who once commanded attention. In her place was someone diminished by the weight of her own choices. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. As proceedings began, Jason felt a mixture of anger and resolve. This was the moment where years of trust, love, and betrayal would culminate into a reckoning. The presentation of evidence. Daniel approached the bench with a calm but commanding presence. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about betrayal, fraud, and justice. My client, Mr. Jason Carter, has endured financial and emotional harm at the hands of his wife, Sarah Carter. We will present undeniable evidence of forgery and fraud committed by the defendant." Jason listened intently as Daniel laid out the timeline of events. First, the forged loan documents were presented, with an expert witness confirming that Jason's signature had been falsified. Next came the bank statement showing the transfer of funds to Eric Thompson, who had conveniently disappeared. The icing on the cake was Sarah's written admission, which Daniel had coaxed out during a pre-trial negotiation. When Daniel displayed photographs of Sarah and Eric together, taken by Jason's investigator, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Each piece of evidence struck like a hammer, methodically building the case against Sarah. Sarah's defense. Sarah's lawyer, a young but seasoned attorney named Melissa Grant, attempted to mitigate the damage. "Your Honor," she argued, "Mrs. Carter acknowledges her mistakes, but she was manipulated by Eric Thompson, a known con artist. She never intended to harm her husband." Melissa painted a picture of Sarah as a victim, someone swept up in Eric's schemes. She emphasized Sarah's remorse and the lengths she had gone to reconcile with Jason. This isn't a story of malice, Melissa concluded. It's a story of vulnerability and regret. Jason clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to interrupt. Vulnerability? Regret? Sarah had made calculated choices, and he wasn't about to let her escape accountability. The confrontation. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Sarah was cornered. When she took the stand, she avoided Jason's gaze, her voice trembling as she spoke. I was lost, she stammered. Eric made me feel like I mattered. I thought I was helping him, but I didn't realize how much I was hurting Jason. Daniel rose for cross-examination. Mrs. Carter, he began, his tone measured, are you suggesting that Mr. Thompson forged your husband's signature without your knowledge? Sarah hesitated. No, I signed it. So, you knowingly forged your husband's signature to secure a $75,000 loan? Daniel pressed. Yes, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. And despite knowing this was illegal, you proceeded to transfer the funds to Mr. Thompson's account, is that correct? Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded. Yes. Jason felt a pang of something, perhaps pity, but he quickly shoved it aside. This wasn't the time for sympathy. A twist. Just when it seemed the trial had reached its climax, Daniel introduced a twist. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Carter was not only complicit in the initial fraud, but was planning additional financial schemes with Mr. Thompson. He presented emails Sarah had exchanged with Eric, outlining plans to access more of Jason's assets. Sarah's face turned ashen as the emails were read aloud. Jason stared at her, his expression unreadable. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about calculated greed. The judge's gavel struck, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Carter, the judge said sternly, this court finds your actions egregious and harmful. Fraud is a serious crime, and your intent to continue these actions only compounds the severity. The verdict. The court ruled in Jason's favor. Sarah was held liable for the fraudulent loan, ordered to pay restitution, and faced potential criminal charges. The judge's words were clear. This court will not tolerate such blatant breaches of trust and legality. As the verdict was read, Sarah broke down completely, her sobs echoing in the silent room. Jason remained composed, though the weight of everything hit him like a tidal wave. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The woman he had once loved was now a stranger, her life in shambles. Moving forward. After the trial, Jason stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. Daniel joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You did well in there, he said. It's over. Jason nodded, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. The legal battle might be over, but the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. He thanked Daniel and walked to his car, taking a moment to sit in silence before starting the engine. In the weeks that followed, Jason began to rebuild his life. He immersed himself in work, spent more time with friends and family, and even took up a new hobby, hiking. The betrayal had left its mark, but it hadn't broken him. A final encounter. Months later, Jason ran into Sarah at a coffee shop. She looked weary, her once polished appearance now faded. She approached him hesitantly. Jason, she began, her voice soft. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Jason looked at her for a long moment before replying. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Sarah. I really do. And with that, he walked away, leaving the past behind him. The morning after the trial's conclusion, Jason woke with an unfamiliar feeling. Freedom. For the first time in months, there were no looming court dates, no late-night strategy sessions with his lawyer, and no unanswered questions about Sarah's betrayal. The weight he had carried for so long had finally lifted. Standing by the window, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, Jason looked out at the world with fresh eyes. He had survived the unthinkable, a complete upheaval of his life. But now, it was time to rebuild, not just his finances and reputation, but his sense of self. Feeling and reflection, Jason began each day with purpose. He returned to the small joys he had forgotten in the chaos, morning jogs along the river, weekend hikes in the mountains, and evenings spent reading books that had long gathered dust on his shelf. Each activity was a step toward rediscovering who he was outside the confines of his former marriage. He also sought support in unexpected places. Jason joined a local support group for individuals recovering from infidelity and betrayal. At first, he was hesitant to share his story, but as he listened to others speak about their experiences, he found solidarity in their shared pain. When it was his turn to speak, the words came naturally. I thought I knew who Sarah was, Jason admitted to the group. But the person I trusted with my life was capable of things I couldn't have imagined. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing how blind I'd been to it. A man across the room nodded. It's not about being blind, he said. It's about trusting someone you loved. That's not a weakness, Jason. That's being here. Rebuilding connections. Jason also reconnected with his sister, Melissa, who lived a few towns away. She had been one of the first to offer support when the scandal broke, and now she insisted he visit more often. You need to remember you're not alone, Melissa said during one of their dinners. Family's always here. Through these visits, Jason rekindled bonds with his nieces and nephews, their laughter and carefree energy reminding him of life's lighter side. He realized that while Sarah had taken much from him, she hadn't taken everything. She had a chance encounter. One Saturday morning, Jason decided to try a new coffee shop on the recommendation of a colleague. As he waited in line, a voice behind him caught his attention. Excuse me, is that the latest Modern Architecture Digest? Jason turned to see a woman in her late 30s with curly brown hair and a friendly smile, pointing to the magazine under his arm. She had an effortless warmth that immediately put him at ease. It is, Jason replied, holding it up. Are you into architecture? I'm an interior designer, she said, extending her hand. Claire? Jason shook her hand, introducing himself. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything from their professions to their favorite hiking trails. By the time Jason left the cafe, he had Claire's number, a quiet justice. Meanwhile, news of Sarah's legal troubles spread through their community. While Jason avoided gossip, he couldn't ignore the calls and emails from old friends and acquaintances expressing their support. Sarah, it seemed, had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of deceit. Though Jason felt no satisfaction in her downfall, he did feel vindicated. His name was cleared and the truth was undeniable. More looking ahead, months turned into a year, and Jason found himself thriving in ways he hadn't expected. His business flourished as he poured his energy into new projects, his focus sharper than ever. His relationship with Claire grew, her empathy and humor bringing light to his days. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Jason's newly renovated home, Claire turned to him. Do you ever think about the past? She asked softly. Jason considered her question, the weight of his answer pressing against his chest. I do, he admitted. But not the way I used to. The past taught me what I value, what I deserve, and what I won't tolerate. It's part of my story, but it doesn't define me anymore. Claire smiled, squeezing his hand. You've come a long way. Jason gazed at the horizon, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Not because everything had returned to normal, but because he had built something better. Closing the chapter, one final loose end remained. Jason received word that Sarah had moved out of town, starting over in a modest apartment far from the life they had shared. He never reached out, and neither did she. Their paths, once intertwined, now diverged completely. Jason didn't hold hatred for Sarah anymore. She was part of his past, a chapter in his story that he had finished reading, and now he was writing a new one, with every page filled with promise. As he looked forward to the future, Jason understood the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest betrayals lead to the most profound transformations.